So, hello, colleagues. I think we're about to start this session, and I'd like to welcome all of you, particularly those of you who are connected from afar. It's not too many of us in New York here. You can probably see us on video, but I understand we have about 8 colleagues across the globe who have connected. So, welcome to you, and you'll have a chance to perhaps pose some questions later on. Let me welcome Lila Sadiko, who's here today. She's making a special time to present some of her work out of Istanbul, working with Millie and her colleagues in Istanbul, which is really the sort of cutting edge work the UNDP is doing on many levels, looking beyond our looking beyond just tech as a way to further innovation. It's really the most interesting stuff that's coming out of our innovation portfolio. I'd like to thank also Arbeck and the Bureau for hosting this. It's great to be here. So I think without further ado, I'll give you the floor, Lila, and we look forward to hearing from you about your the work that you and your team are doing around cities and around new forms of work and what the implications are for policy making and how we in UNDP, you guys in Istanbul, are looking to provide support and tools for governments and decentralized governments to make better decisions around services. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that introduction. I hope I'll be able to live up to it. I'll do my best. So we'll have, I think, the presentation up in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. So
and have that on screen, right? If colleagues can see that as well.
Cool. It's like the Matrix.
This is my favorite part of BBL is when it does that. I'm like, yeah.
It's the Matrix. So I'm very happy to be here today, and especially to talk about 2 lines of work that are actually quite exciting, that we've been working on for the last 8 months, on 2 topics, which at least from our end, we think are really important for UNDP's work and for UNDP's future. But obviously, which are sometimes in the fuzzy, right? So it's really difficult sometimes to see the signals that are coming around these issues. And we're trying to understand what is happening in this gray space. So the 2 things I'll talk about today are the work we're planning around, or the work we're doing on cities, and some of the exploratory work we've been doing with Oxford University, Oxford Internet Institute around online labor. Now, while these 2 topics may seem very disconnected, in fact, there's a convergence point for both of them. And I'll get into that later when I get to the point on digital economy and platform economies. So why do we think it's worth looking into cities? Obviously, we know majority of people live right now in cities. So officially, UN says, our statistics say that around 70% of people will be living in cities by 2050. In fact, European Space Agency and European Commission did a study where they saw that human settlement goes up to 70, or the world, around 70 to 85% of the world's population is already living in cities. So there's, even in terms of how we understand who is living in urban spaces, there's a discrepancy. The other issue is, or in fact, the other reason why we decided it was good to look into cities are threefold. On one hand, the innovation team in Istanbul had been working with, had been experimenting for the last 5 to 6 years on different things. One, we were looking at new data and how we could use it for SDGs. We're looking at social innovation, quite a bit of behavioral insights. And then we've been, as I'm sure people know, who are on the call and who are here, been doing quite a bit of work around alternative finance and testing out new financial mechanisms. However, after we had reviewed our portfolio, we realized that what it actually makes sense is that all of these approaches, could come together quite well in a city to start to look to understand problems in a more systemic way, but also start approaching on how they're, or start addressing them in a more inclusive, again, like in a more systemic manner, and also to look at what are the different forms of financial mechanisms that we could be applying to be able to close the funding gap that we have for SDGs. The second reason is, or maybe the third, because the first one is obviously population concentration. The third reason would be the smart city discussion has been very much concentrated and kidnapped, if to just be a little bit provocative, by companies that are providing ready-made solutions to governments in contracts that the governments end up being locked for years, and they have struggled to get out. What we've seen from the first wave or second wave of smart cities is that while maybe there are some efficiency gains because people understand better what is going on, or decision makers understand better what is going on in their cities, and maybe traffic functions faster, what it doesn't do really doesn't bring legitimacy to the government, and it also doesn't really do much for the social contract overall. So we thought this is a good space for UNDP to start exploring how we can use some of these technologies, how we can use the approaches in terms of the innovative approaches, as well as the incredible work we've been doing around citizen engagement, to start addressing issues and understanding them in a different way. So I don't know if people on the call know this, but we can obviously share the information later. Last month, we launched something that's called City Experiment Fund. This comes with funding from the Slovak Ministry of Finance. And there's, before I go into the substance areas of it, there's three things that we're trying to hit with the fund. First of all, what we want to do is we want to start to understand what is happening in cities differently, so in more systemic manner. So we've called it Unpacking Complexity. And I'll take a simple example that I think I've overused at this stage, but maybe the other people on the other line have not heard me. Air pollution is something that comes up in the Western Balkans regularly. So currently there's 3 cities in the Western Balkans that are actually working actively on addressing air pollution. Now, our team in Skopje worked to see who loses and who stands to gain out of air pollution. And the first assumption, I think Yasmina and the team there, I don't know if they're on the call, but if I think when there was the administrators called, they mentioned this. The first assumption they had is that air pollution was a result of traffic congestion. However, after doing quite a bit of extensive data analysis and using sensors and using different ways to understand this, it turns out air pollution had inequality dimensions. First of all, because the source of air pollution, main contributor was heating. And it was low calorie and low wood heating. So it was homes that were not connected to district heating that were contributing the most. The second, obviously, this had dimensions of inequality. So the households which were poor, people who were less likely to be employed, so households that had lower levels of education were more exposed to air pollution. And we know from research that was done in other places that not only is there a health impact, but there's obviously a correlation as well to the, not correlation, but actually being exposed to air pollution also decreases IQ points. I would like to really see a UNDP program that in the future addresses education as a part of addressing actually air pollution in the long run. Yeah. So that's in terms of unpacking complexity. So what are the links that are not really clear? Because in reality, the way that people that we work with experience the problems are very different from the ways that we're addressing them. And that's the same goes for municipalities. At the same time that I live in Istanbul, I don't have issue with waste collection. I'm pretty good at that. But I'm experiencing issues with traffic, and I'm experiencing issues with the quality of air, and all of these issues come together in one space. However, usually, both from the government perspective and our perspective, we tend to give one solution to all, or siloed ways of addressing it. So if we understand our hypothesis, our assumption here is if we understand the problem better, then we're going to come to a better portfolio of experiments, which are going to seek to address the problem, which is step 2, to address the problem in a more holistic way. So if I keep going with the air pollution example, what is the line of 5 different experiments that would be addressing the different sides of that same problem, whether it's identity, education, access to health, access to public transport, rather than just saying, in order to address this problem, we need to extend district heating, and then the second one would be maybe to improve public transport. But what is the range of experiments that we can bring into the picture so we can start to address the system? The third part is, which is really important to the team, is we know that cities around the world, bless you, we know that the cities around the world face face similar problems. The contexts are different, but they are struggling with similar issues. They are struggling with urban, so with degradation of infrastructure, they're struggling with air pollution. However, how these issues manifest themselves are different. So what we want to do as well through the fund that we've started is build a cohort of cities that they're obviously learning and sharing from one another, but also that we turn this into, I mean, for lack of a better word, case studies, which can further, I think replication means copying, but at least where people can learn from one another, learn from the process and replicate a process, which brings us to a more systemic understanding to more systemic solutions. Now, okay, maybe I'll do that in the end. And to do this, we've identified a number of zones of experimentation which combine innovative approaches and innovative technologies, as well as and seek to address the problem in an intersectional way. There's many more, right? These are some that we've identified. These are some that we've prioritized, at least for the first. As we start now and as we learn, obviously this is going to be, and as the conversation around these issues evolves, this is going to keep growing. So the ones that I'll highlight today are around the municipal back office, well-being, arts and science, which is not always our default, or a new area, out of comfort zone a little bit, new urban infrastructures and the platform economy. On the municipal back office, there's different ways that we thought actually about understanding this. So I think the lo-fi solution on using technology in government has been to go towards digital government, right? So we're going to do e-government solution, and that there's going to be government 2.0. If we look at what's going on outside of not just outside of the organization, but what's going on in terms of overall, how technology is being deployed, obviously this is underutilization of the potential that exists out there. Now the question we get asked is, well, there's a digital divide, right? And I think there's two, I just want to make a distinction. There's two things. One is in terms of bringing everybody online, and there's a different aspect of it, which is bringing everybody online and doing so, having in mind the ethical considerations and the skills that need to be built. And the other is using technology to make better decisions and to make better decisions. Let's leave it at that, and to make better policy. So I'm sure many of you have heard already about the work that was done in New Zealand. So there was a sprint of 3 weeks in terms of how, and actually I think this resonates very well with a lot of the countries we work in, was especially in terms of how between policy, legislation, and implementation, technology could be used to streamline that process. So for example, if we look at service delivery, how service delivery can be done in a way that's based on algorithm, so that people receive the service, and that is done in line with the legislation and the policy. And if I think about a lot of the countries where we work in, actually one of the weakest points is the implementation of legislation. Right, so connection between implementation, policy, and legislation. The other angle, or the other zone of experimentation, it's not an angle, we're looking into is well-being. Obvious one is health and environment. And during innovation days, we had Metasub in Istanbul, which is an outfit that basically uses technology and uses biology labs around different universities in the world to look at how whether we can use DNA sequencing to understand and predict outbreaks in cities by taking samples from public spaces. So this is done together with the universities, right? And this helps in terms of predicting where the outbreaks are going to come, and especially in starting to see if there's any, I think now with antibiotic resistance, in what the markers look like as well, and how's that playing out in the public space in particular. The third intersection we have been looking into is around arts and science. And I've taken quite a few examples, so heads up around innovation days. So we had Invisible Dust come and visit in Istanbul, or actually do a presentation in Istanbul. And that's a collective, a gallery that uses arts as a way to translate, this is in my words, it translates really complex things into ways that turn relatable. And I'm, again, just to be a little bit provocative, I think one of the issues that we faced with the human rights and anti-corruption movements overall has been that these concepts, even at the civil society level, have always been kept by an elite, and they've never really translated into things that become relatable to people. So if I'm in a village in Moldova, why do human rights matter to me rather than what does that mean for my rights, right? So when we think about air pollution and climate change and similar issues, what we want to do is use or explore how arts can be used as a bridge for that. So what Invisible Dust does, interestingly enough, is, for example, I think this is sensor-based, what is this, outfit, with a number of different performers going around the city of London, and the outfits turn redder or greener depending on the quality of the air outside. Interestingly enough, what they found in London is that the neighborhoods which were richer were actually the ones that were more exposed to air pollution. So, sorry, some of the highest degrees of air pollution were around parks in richer neighborhoods, because the parents were driving their kids to the parks with their cars, hanging out in their cars with their engine turned on and waiting for their kids to come back into the car. So I think it starts to translate in a much more understandable way on why we need to shift our behaviors in particular things. How we need to shift our behaviors. Well, that's a typo. Or it's not a typo, that's a mistake. So the other area where, I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, what we're looking at as well is basically how infrastructure is actually crumbling. Again, across, and whether the infrastructure we have in place is able to actually sustain, in places where we have higher migration flows, is able to sustain a higher number of people. In places where we don't have, where people are leaving the countries, what does that mean in terms of how people feel in a city, right? And then the other elements in terms of quality of life. Now, the default is generally, when we talk about urban infrastructure, is can we fix the potholes? And I would say it's great to fix the potholes and to fix the stairs in my neighborhood, but what does that mean in terms of, my quality of life, or what does it mean in terms of the air being clear? What we see in the edges happening actually is new ways in which biology, technology, and infrastructure is coming together to be able to use existing spaces in different ways. And I'll take two examples. One is curtains made of algae, and again, this is in the edges. Curtains made of algae, which gets activated when the level of air pollution reaches a certain level, and it starts to clean the air. And this has been tested, and it works. Obviously, we can talk about the scale at a different point, but there is a way to do that, and it's been tested. I think it was there was a demonstration in Ireland a couple of months ago. The other way is, can we use 3D printing to fix potholes in a more sustainable way, and in a way that actually creates less impacts on the environment? Now, which brings me to, and I said there was a convergence, so maybe this is the point where I link up to that. So I guess going back to the point where we looked at cities is also, the reason why we looked at cities as well is because there's quite a bit of decentralized activity that is happening in urban spaces. So normally things that were reserved for, or not reserved, functions that were performed by the nation states, very often it's actually the cities that are taking the lead. So if we look at the global, at the climate change work that is led by Bloomberg, but also there's other examples of that where cities are actually like sandboxing of different technologies. We see this, we see the cities taking lead on that. And when we were talking to our cities, actually, in our region for the City Experiment Fund, we realized that a lot of the issues they face are actually, it's just, there's an imbalance, right? Like there's an economic imbalance. And one of the opportunities that we have now, or one of the things that we at least thought we saw, is that with digital labor, with globalization, further globalization, and with what internet has actually done to to delete some of these or to blur some of the boundaries, this can have a profound impact on economies and cities themselves. And so we didn't start from cities, we started from digital economy, but it actually converges with the cities. We wanted to understand a few things. One is what are the trends that we are seeing, right? What are we seeing in terms of digital economy out there? One thing where we struggled, and I'll say that openly, and it remains to be discussed, is how do we actually define what digital economy is? I think there's parts of the organization that would say it has to do generally with e-business and e-commerce. There's parts that are looking at other angles of it. And the best definition I found came out, the best definition I found is something like a spectrum, which is between how using the digital to change, digitizing products, services, or goods. And on the other end of the spectrum is where the delivery, the good itself, is actually a digital product. Now, we've been working for the last 6 to 7 months. What are we now? In March, 8 months, with Oxford Internet Institute, focusing in particular on online labor. And I'll speak shortly in terms of why we think this is particularly important. And we wanted to see, one, is this trend actually relevant enough for UNDP to look into? Two is, what are some of the early insights that we can discern, and where should we look for them, right? This is not something that's going to show up on any kind of statistics. This is not something that's going to show up on any kind of trade, national trade balances. And then the third question we try to answer is, what does this mean for our work? What does this mean for the labor market programs that we have? And what does this mean for the ALMP programs, any of them that we have? And in terms of generally how we work in the different countries. It's not a very clear photo, but it'll tell you something, which is the majority. So in a short note, we, together with Oxford Internet Institute, we looked at data that comes from online labor platforms. So in general, it's English-speaking platforms, and they cover between 70 to 80% of the market out there. This here on the global supply and global demand was done together with the SD team here, and we looked at Upwork, which is the biggest platform out there, and covers maybe around 30% of the work. And what we see here is that, unfortunately, fuzzily, is the majority of the supply of labor comes from, so the bluer it is, the more supply there is, right? So it comes from, you can see there the distribution. In particular, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, there's really high concentration, as well as in Asia Pacific. But look at the global demand of labor. The majority of the demand actually comes from North America, a few countries in the EU, so UK and Germany in particular, and then Australia and India. We had a chance to delve deeper into Europe and CIS and look at, especially analyze, what are the skills that people who are actually working on, the people that are on these platforms have. And I think, and I'll speak shortly in terms of the implications this has. What you don't see here is that in online labor platforms over the last 3 years, so there's 6 categories that we've covered here. So it's writing and translation, software development, sales, professional services, creative and multimedia, and clerical and data entry. Besides, so the 2 that are skyrocketing in terms of demand are software development and creative and multimedia. Everything else is either stagnating or actually decreasing over time. If you look at the picture of our region, and now I see I have to actually get up for this. So if you look at the picture for our region, Kazakhstan has quite a bit of the supply on the online platforms is actually based on writing and translation. If we think about automation, these are the kind of jobs that are actually very likely to be automated, not now, like not in 10 years from now, like now. The software for natural language processing is quite good. And we see that countries in particular, Ukraine, Montenegro, Serbia, and and actually Russia as well, and Belarus have quite a bit of high level of supply in terms of especially software and creative and multimedia, which are the parts, which are basically the skills that are being in higher demand. What we'll be looking at, so I think what's an interesting point, so there's a digital summit coming up in the Western Balkans. What we'll be looking at going further is to see how does this play out at the municipal level. And what we know already is that in the Western Balkans, for example, there is a much better distribution across, so outside of the capitals, whereas in Belarus and Ukraine, majority of the activity is focused in, so in Ukraine is Odessa and is Kiev, and in Belarus it's around Minsk. So we see that this opportunity could actually, this could actually be a way to bridge also regional disparities within the countries themselves. And then we did a deep dive into Africa as well. And in the research, what we found is that the majority of the work that was done in Africa is actually is lower paid work, right? And I'll say in a minute why this becomes important. So we looked at GitHub Data and the linkage to inequality. So we looked at GitHub Data. And for people who are not very familiar with GitHub, GitHub is basically like a social media platform where people post their code. And so people follow one another from around the world, and usually, so it's around open source software. So you follow people that you basically can learn from and you can take their code from. And we noticed that there was a very clear concentration in terms of followship, right? Followship. Majority of developers, even though we're actually coming in, and this is, even though the majority of developers were coming from not North America, and so from other places in North America and EU, majority of the traffic was towards those parts of the world, right? Or the developers who are coming from those parts of the world. Where this becomes important is twofold. One is it means that quite a bit of the research and development and innovation is happening, is concentrating. It's actually further concentrating. I think there's implications, and even if we look at the online labor for Africa, there's implications in terms of whether if we don't do the interventions now, we don't intervene now, there's implications in terms of exacerbating inequality. And the ability of countries to leapfrog or not, and to actually take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. Countries that have, for example, India and actually Serbia as well, that have invested in the ICT sector have been able to leapfrog and to actually start benefiting from it. So what we see happen with, and I think this is where the research becomes interesting, is what we see happen is that obviously, the inequalities we have in real life, with the inequalities we have now, basically just translate into the digital world, but at a speed at which we're not used to dealing with. So, for example, Serbia has been investing in the last 3-4 years significantly in ICT skills for its young people, and so for upskilling people, and it shows. It shows in terms of both their trade balance and the ability to export in ICT, but also shows in terms of how much they're able to benefit from the opportunities that exist out there. And this is only, I mean, what I should have said, is only a signal, right? This is not comprehensive in terms of saying, well, we know now everything that happens in online labor, because there's a lot of things that still happen in informality, but it does show that where there is investment, where there is concentrated effort, that essentially brings also value for the economy, for the economy overall. And the other, I think, implication, so we also had a workshop at the end of last year with other regions in Istanbul. The other implications that are coming out of it, and I think that are worth considering, are multifold. One is, what does this mean in terms of rights? So what does it mean in terms, so a lot of people who are in the online, they're doing freelance, so obviously there's no protections. There's, what are the rights? Even if you're like an Uber driver, you probably don't know other people who are Uber drivers unless they're friends. And where there's more questions, where is our intervention there? The other issue that I think comes up is, what is the implication on the social contract? The industries were organized So a part of our social contract was the fact that our job was linked to a particular city or to a particular state, right? So we lived and worked in the same place. If majority of the services, and we see that through other work as well, if our income comes from a different part of the world, if the majority of the services we're getting are actually privatized and are maybe global, Amazon's providing health services now as well, what does that mean in terms of relationship the citizens have to the state? So those are, and obviously the third aspect would be, especially if we look at the tech sector, which is a sector that is very dynamic and is very quickly changing. It's like, how can we build agility in the way that we develop skills and the way that we learn, so that actually the countries where we work can benefit? And the fourth, actually, and now I remember the fourth point is, we've seen two approaches in terms of dealing with digitalization, right? Like digital development. One is things are happening in the gray area. So the governments don't really have a capacity. They don't really understand. If you look at blockchain, there's nobody who can regulate blockchain. All the countries in the Western Balkans, actually people mine Bitcoin and it consumes more energy than what people consume. Just the mining, it actually takes up more electricity energy. And there's a figure somewhere, which I didn't show now. So the governments just don't know how to respond to this until they see the risks of it, which is then the knee-jerk reaction is to just shut it down and use restrictive regulation. So where we want to go with some of this work is not only look at the ICT skills, obviously also look at how industries are actually being transformed through digitization. But the third is, how can we work with the governments in our region to navigate that gray space in a way that actually starts to bring results and in a way that helps us to understand the risks while they're developing, especially as these are really new areas. So we've been talking, I was talking yesterday to somebody from who's looking at AI, so ethics in artificial intelligence. And I was saying, what about ethics in spatial computing, which is something that's happening already? So the division between our digital and physical worlds are blurring. Like, this is not again science fiction. It's actually really close. And how are we going to be able to navigate that space unless we start to engage with those topics and unless we start to experiment in that space and start to understand it more in depth and how it's playing out in different parts of the world? So I think I'll end at that.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Lai. That was very comprehensive and very stimulating. And I'm sure a lot of the colleagues here have a lot of questions. I do have some, but let's see if we can get perhaps some of the colleagues in the room to kick off a discussion. We got a good 20 minutes, I think, so that's a good time for a follow-up discussion. And then we'll ask our colleagues out who are connected to see if they want to come in. Any takers? Nick, please.
Good, Lila, thank you so much. On behalf of the Regional Bureau, it's been great over the last couple of years watching the successive innovation days happening and these experiments coming together as they are in the urban discussion is a really significant move forwards. And I just have one question, particularly on the last part that you were talking about on the digital development and jobs and inequalities. And I'm thinking in the connection between this and what we know about global value chains. Yeah. And if we're talking about connecting skills development and job creation in a way which is going to be linking people into the global value chains, which we're also looking at being disrupted in the not so distant future. I mean, how sustainable is if this is where we're heading, or are we looking at more sort of, I don't know, interregional connections, south-south connections? How's the thinking? Is there thinking along those lines beyond just creating jobs and skills and employment, but sort of what they're tied to in terms of their sustainability?
Yeah, so that's a tough question.
Not to put you on the spot, right?
Yes, no, it's a good start, because I assume from here it's just going to be easier. So I think it really depends actually from sector to sector. And so obviously here there's more in terms of the work that we did. There's much more emphasis on where the good itself is a digital good, right? Which by default is something that changes actually the value chain. So you don't have to be in the same space. It's something that is global by default, right? So you can work anywhere to be able to provide a service that has to do either with creative work or with software development. And that, I think that shifts, I don't know, that there's a value chain related to that. What we want to go further into actually is look at exactly what you're saying, is to see how the different industries will be impacted by these changes that we're seeing. And again, because this is developing so fast, one of the ways in which we were thinking about, so one of the discussions we've had has been with the private sector center on looking at 3D printing in particular, right? And how its impact on a number of different industries, which could be actually construction as well, and what that is going to do for the value chain. Another discussion we've had has been around, and Bernardo and I were talking about it yesterday, is to see how are industries changing, but not only that, if you're working in agriculture, and you're looking to benefit from the fourth industrial revolution and all of that, what are the kind of skills that are being built, and how is that sector actually shifting? What we can learn from that in a way that we can actually start to change how we also deliver programs in the countries where we work. And that is much more difficult to actually get the insights for. So we're looking at, so there's a number of databases where companies will have the profiles that they're hiring for and the profiles that they have, and start to understand, so how are the industries changing the profile of their workers? So just to say is quite exploratory at this stage, but I think obviously we're seeing the at least in terms of the capacities, that the lines or the borders have blurred.
And just to add, Nick, one of the reasons we got into the work is that governments are entirely blind to what's happening with the online labor. There isn't a sort of national statistics proxy or an indicator that's capable of catching this. And for us, with the former Soviet Union set of countries that has incredible capacities around programming and tech, we see a lot of Ukraine, for example. We have tens of thousands of people making income that's not taxed, where they don't have social nets underneath them. There is no awareness as to what is their profile. Is this contributing or addressing inequality? The implications for skills. And interestingly enough, Leila mentioned social contract, right? So the whole aspect of worker rights. How do you regulate parts of the economy that pop up and die out within a year to 18 months. So for example, we had a case where we were tracking the engagement of programmers building websites, being contracted to build websites. And then when Google came up with an algorithm that would build a website for yourself, you could see the trend going like this. And then in January, it just dropped. So the whole segment of workers doing something overnight was out of that job. Now they can repurpose their skills for something else.
Yeah.
But if you were to protect their rights in this particular sector, so it's really challenging, and governments do not, it's unintelligible. They're not able to read what's happening. So for us, especially in the innovation team, this has been a really big area for growth, being able to pick up policy spaces where governments are flying blind, and then trying to make sense of them and turn them into something that become our programs and projects.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Owen.
Yes, thank you very much. This perhaps one clarification and a question. You described this, the city experiment fund, and then the 3 steps, that you follow. I didn't get it very well. I mean, what you were describing, for example, on the experimentation side, holistic experimentation of municipality back office, art and science, and so on, is that all related to to pollution, or it's a package that you are saying we are offering this as a package to address problems that you would have identified and unpacking the complexity of an area. So that's one. And then the second thing is I don't know much about Europe and CIS, but I'm just wondering, with all this type of work that you're doing, which really seems, excellent, how is this changing the policy and programming of the region in the region in Europe and CIS?
So a few things. On the first one, in terms of where the steps come in and where the experiments come in, I just took air pollution as an illustrative example, as one of the issues, especially because we have 3 cities in Western Balkans that are struggling with air pollution, that have different programs that look at different angles of it, right? So it's just to illustrate. But in fact, what we're doing with cities is we're going with them and with the governments through a process to define what is the type of issue that they want to address, and then seeing what are the hidden links on that issue. So for example, in Moldova, one of the problems that we expect, I don't know if the Moldova team is going to be here, but one of the problems that keeps coming up is traffic. But what we want to get at is, why do people move? What prompts them to move from one part of town to another one? So it's an issue that has economic dimensions, I would say, and we're still not at a point where I can say this is exactly how it plays out in Moldova. But we're trying to see what are the hidden connections, what are some of the non-direct links. And air pollution was just an illustrative example. In terms of what the countries get, is basically what we're trying to do now, or what we're working on now, is go with them through a process of defining what the problem is, using new data. So we have a partnership with the German Space Institute on using spatial information to understand how the particular place, a particular city, is changing over the last 30 years. What are the gases in the atmosphere? What's the green space changing? How's the green space changing? How's that interacting with built environment? So it gives us one snapshot, which is, mind you, big data, and from a macro perspective, how is the spaces where we're working and changing? The other part that we're adding into this is to look at what's happening on the ground, where our country offices become the source of that intelligence. So, for lack of a better word, what does the ethnography look like? Or what is happening in these communities, and how we can complement this big picture, this macro perspective, with the reality on the ground? Whether, I don't want to go down into the tools, but basically how can we get those insights? And there come workshops with communities, micro narratives. So we're using different methods depending on the context. So that gives us an overview of what the issue is. The examples I took in terms of how we're looking to address, and I see now it might have sounded a little bit like converging around air pollution, is to look at the different types of ways in which we can address it. And it's very likely, or it's most likely, that none of those examples are actually going to turn out exactly like the way that I presented them, because it needs to be contextualized for Chisinau and for Kragujevac and for Sarajevo. It needs to be contextualized in the given space, but it's just to give a sense of, we could be hitting more than one point. We could be addressing a problem in an intersectional manner, right? Like more from a perspective of how people experience it. So that's and then the third part, or it's not maybe a step, but it's actually more like a part, is how can we extract some learning out of this process. In terms of how the programming is changing in our region, I think there's twofold. So I think there's quite a bit of experimentation that's happening, that will continue to happen in the region, because the demand is actually, there's quite a bit of demand from the governments as well to try to do things, and the donors as well, to do things in a different way. I think what we've seen is a lot of the ways in which have been maybe experimented with through innovation projects have been taken up. So the approaches, whether it's design thinking or systems thinking or behavioral insights, or new data, actually, which is something I've been working on for the last 4 years. And I've seen the organizational attitude change over the last 4 years, from something that's in the margins to being something that becomes a part of how we understand. I'm taking now just new data, but it becomes a part of the programming. So, and Millie's here, and she's been leading the work in innovation in Europe, in our region now more than that. My understanding, or my view, is that even if, which there seems to be very often quite a bit of pressure, even if the particular innovation hasn't scaled to address the entire issue, the way that we start to understand and the way that we address the problem is shifting around that. So I'm taking, again, big data as an example. Used to be in the margins, used to be would be a small project. There is currently, I would say, majority of the governments that we work with are actually saying, can you help us? Actually, we're working with Turkey government on using credit card information to change behaviors in tourism. That's a massive project to actually influence. And normally, 2 years ago, we had an innovation facility that were booking in TripAdvisor data to understand how the tourism sector looks like in Albania. So I think this is the way that our programming, that is much harder to capture. We can tell it in anecdotal evidence. It's much harder to capture, but I think this is the way that it's changing.
And I think the interesting part from the perspective of organizational change is that we have seen interesting things emerge in the urban space for 4 or 5 years now, and have tried to bring this to country offices with very little interest. What changed at the end of, and we're still trying to figure out where this comes from. There are two things that changed at the end of 2016 to 17. One, we started getting a lot of requests from country offices around our local development programs are really stale. The partners are not really responding. I mean, we're signing our cost sharing agreements, we're getting some money, but it's copy pasting of what we've been doing for 10 years. Is there something else that we can think through? So this is from the UNDP side. And again, we don't have anybody in the governance team here. We've had discussions with our governance team leader quite a bit around this. So this is one. And then that coincided with a whole new generation of mayors in Western Balkans and Caucasus who came into power coincidentally, who said, there was a sort of we want to appear modern and urban and ahead of times, and we want to do something new. Right, so not necessarily an interest to change policy or lift people out of poverty. We want to appear. So it was optics moment. So those two converged for us to be able to come forward and propose a program that we have been watching and trying to understand, but really from a distance, not from the perspective of integrating in a program. Now, if you take that, we're talking about a period of 2 to 4 years from the moment we picked up a signal, started following it, started talking and with different partners and building our ecosystem, but really merely from the perspective of the team, to now being turned into a product that we're generating revenues for. That's 2 to 4 years. That's too long. That's really long. So the question becomes, what is the criteria through which we make a decision whether an emerging trend, blockchain, for example, we spent about 1.5 years watching it before deciding to invest money into. Right, but that's not for these reasons. It was more of a hype than it was anything else. So what is the criteria by which we get to keep watching something or start playing with it?
Can I just follow up?
I'm just going to make sure that we have 15 people online, so I want to make sure they have a chance to also post some questions, if anything. So we'll give them a chance to do that. And meanwhile, if you want to pose your follow-up question, then I'll have a quick question as well. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, perhaps, just thinking aloud here. Well, I work on livelihoods and economic recovery, and quite for a long time. And now when I interact with you and so on, it's like you're people coming from another world or something like that, because the type of language and so on that you speak to, it's not very familiar with me. So for me, I think we really need to do something as an organization. Really, either issues around innovation needs to be something that is what do you call it? Everyone has to be trained on that. It should be compulsory that at least once a year I get into the system and I follow a certain training or something like that on innovation, because with that, then when I do my own work in cities where you are not there, I have this in mind, and it comes naturally. But for now, it doesn't come naturally. Yeah. It comes natural, of course, now, and not natural. It comes now because I have been in these, brown bag lunches and so on and so on. I think it's an important thing for the organization to take note of. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a good point, Owen, you make, and it's always good to see the colleagues from across different sectors come in. My point on this is that this need not be about innovation.
Yeah.
I mean, Lila works in the governance space. This is about governance and providing tools and policy trade-offs type research that allow governments to be better at providing services, at taking having a sense of what kind of labor stock they really have that can build economies or extract revenues on. So I think one important mental shift is that we need to stop a little bit thinking about innovation as innovation, but really look at it as being the fundamental issue of relevance for UNDP. There's a big gap, and you just highlighted it. That sometimes our thinking is very solid, but perhaps does not keep pace with some of this incredible energy that comes out, for lack of a better word, from the digital type and the fourth industrial revolution. But fundamentally, it goes straight into our signature solutions. The beauty of this, I think, is that it's finally we're moving as an organization, including the work that Gina is doing, because there's a very strong connection, I think. And that was my next question. How do we reconcile this kind of experimental type proposition with a very systematic approach around the deployment of the accelerator labs? But the beauty of this, to me, is that we're saying, let's focus on these big ticket items that will put UNDP on the map. And when you hear Lila speaking, of course, you're thinking, you can see connections with the broad migration issue. You can see the connections with, you mentioned the digital divide, of course, and the labor inequality there. And the issue of, say, infrastructure. I mean, these are really the big ticket items. And I like to think that in 5 years down the line, UNDP will be known as the agency, not an agency that has 134 offices that do CPDs and they work in 6 digital solutions, but we are known as these are the lead thinkers on urban in the UN system today, because they have the ability to quickly bring up experiments, build them into a portfolio, figure out what solutions are available. So that's a little bit, I think, also our, it's a call to action for us, for you, for me, to sort of put ourselves in, look beyond the some of the jargon, some of the new fangled type wording, but it's really to say this is the core business of our organization, and that's the reason also why I am very interested also from the knowledge sharing perspective to have these events that really draw on the good work that is being done by our colleagues, and it's increasingly important that we are, particularly as GPN, both Owen and I are in the sort of BPPS/GPN space. It's particularly important that we are connected to all this, so we can rapidly understand and get a package of solutions we can also start to offer. In fact, I had that question about the connections with say accelerator labs type things. If there's been any thinking of that, because I see it as being quite compatible. In a way, it all starts from the same sort of starting point, right? It's just perhaps in Istanbul you have more of a longer leash to start things and get them off the ground right away. As you mentioned, 4 years is a long time, so you want to be able to plan in 6-month type visibility. And I don't need an answer to that question, but I think it's something we need to think about, how to connect all that. Please, one more question from that side.
That was also one of the questions I had, like on the connections, because I can see several. Like the other one I wanted to ask is about, UNDP's digital strategy, right? That's just about to be launched. So, it goes back to the earlier questions, how can we take what we learn in this context and bring it back, right? So do you see a way we can, profit, like you were saying, right? Policy, legislation, implementation, right? But that's also maybe something for us, right? Internally, and how far like our implementation is also lagging behind on certain areas. So if you can elaborate a little bit on that. Also, the link to the platforms, I feel, is important. Like you mentioned air pollution, right? But that is also something that you can totally see a country taking up in the country support platform. And then maybe one last thing is that when you work on innovation, a mega source of innovation is in the online platform. So when I was working there 2 years ago, and there was a big partnership forum, and all these examples came out. They were very much similar to what this is, what you're doing. So they're working on kind of ways to track the Ebola epidemic. I mean, there was really cool, interesting stuff. So maybe it's worthwhile for you to connect to them and pull, because they're also UNDP family, right? To pull, maybe see how you can pull those things in. And they are, again, in a way, linking to your online labor, because it's a digital platform, right? That is drawing from north and south. Yeah. Right. So you have a lot of questions in one question.
Thank you. If you can introduce yourself.
Yes,
For my benefit.
Connie, Connie from the EXO.
All right. Hi, Connie.
So I took a few notes on the digital strategy. I was actually a part of the consultations around the digital strategy. I think what the team from Istanbul has done is actually quite a bit of things that are even, I would say, beyond what the digital strategy envisions, right? It's like the ways in which we're looking at, the fair trade with cocoa with Ecuador, right? It's something that's really on the edge in terms of how we can deploy technology to understand value chains, actually, and to make sure that things are done with integrity. So I would say, the work we did with cryptocurrencies, with Solar Coin in Moldova, it's also really on the edge. So we have strong partnerships with EBRD. We have different partnerships with IFI, so with World Bank as well. They look to us to see how this is being deployed and how this is being used. So, and I think there's a distinction to be made between how UNDP's internal processes are being improved through digitization and digitization, and then how we use technology to have higher development impact. And then the third one being, how do we close the digital divide gap? And when I was a part of the consultation, it seems like even in the consultation itself, there was quite a bit on the digital strategy. There was quite a bit of convergence between two. But these are very different things on how we do things and what are our tools. I think, we're happy, obviously, to share some of the thinking that we've done around this and some of the examples that we've pulled to understand how tech is being used in different ways. I think there's ways in which the strategy could definitely be enhanced to take more advantage of more cutting edge things. Let's put it like that. Because I think it was done with McKinsey together, or by McKinsey. So I think looking at like business,
The strategy?
The strategy. I think it was
McKinsey.
Ernst & Young. Sorry, it's like it's one of those, like Deloitte, Ernst & Young, McKinsey. Anyway, I just remember it was a group of people on the call. So I think the disruptive nature of tech is something in both what we do and in terms of what we use as tools can be enhanced across our country offices. And we're happy to share the things that we've pulled out. On the platforms, so some of it, you mentioned air pollution. I think some of it actually converges naturally. Like air pollution is not something we went out to country offices to do. Like we figured out there's these 3 different projects that are funded by 3 different sources, one of them being with UMV, that are looking at trying to hit similar points, which is use tech, engage communities, work with local governments, address the problem from different perspectives. So I think that's going to naturally converge. And because we're now only, I would say, in prototyping phase, we are definitely looking at ways in which we could bring it together, or so like having a more platformized approach. With a connection with the accelerators, this morning I had a call with Malawi, and they're going to be one of the country offices having an accelerator lab. And they said, well, we found out you guys are working on urbanization, and one of the things that we want to look at is actually urban development in Malawi. So I think this is also because the accelerator labs are being developed now. There's a very strong linkage between the teams that work on innovation and accelerator labs. So I think we're definitely, and Gina and I have a working session tomorrow morning. We're going to be looking at ways in which we can build in some of what we're doing. I'll say, for example, the learning journey we're developing for our country offices actually lends heavily from the work that the Team on Accelerator Lab has done in terms of what are the functions and the capabilities that we build within the teams and the process we go about it. Obviously, all of this is very iterative. And so some of it will, I think, happen naturally, but it's also happening with intent. So by design, we're looking to learn from how the accelerator labs are actually decentralizing innovation in the organization as well, both in terms of functions and capacities. And yes, on UNDs, I'll look into that for sure.
Thank you. And I think we have, we've run over the allotted time. There are 2 quick questions from the field, so to speak, the ones who have connected. If that's okay, I'll ask you those. I want to make sure that those also go. One is from, I assume, Brazil, and is there something being monitored in Latin America or Brazil? Part of the work you do you have any connection there? And the second question is from Sharif, who is
Hi,
saying,
Sharif.
hello, Sharif, who we know well. And it says, based on your experience, are there any lessons learned that you can share with us, especially when you work with municipalities? And I'm sure you have some initial thinking around that. So lessons learned from local municipalities and anything specific in Latin America, as there is interest in that region.
So the Innovation Facility project which is between the SD team and RBAS, RBLAC, and RBEC, has an experiment in Guatemala City where we're looking to use artificial intelligence to understand connection between green and blue development. So it's an SDG hotspots project, and we have Guatemala City is one of the prototypes. The online labor, both the demand and the supply, has data from Latin America, so we'll be happy to share that. And then, so there's, I think the connection is being strengthened, and we've had multiple conversations with the team in Argentina as well, in terms of working with the city of Buenos Aires. That's one part of the question. And Sharif asked, what are the lessons learned?
Around municipalities and working
with the municipalities.
Local governance type.
So I was saying earlier, the experiments are supposed to be intersectional. So at any given point, they should sit between a number of sectors, they should sit between a number of approaches and a number of different technologies. I think what we've learned, even whether that's working with municipalities or working with governance overall, is when we're designing the experiment, what's really important is how do we also design to shift the enabling environment, right? How do we design for that? So what are the kind of citizen engagement, citizen accountability mechanisms that we need to build, what does a governance infrastructure of technology actually look like? And this is a massive issue. If you've been following what's happened with Sidewalk Labs, I mean, I'm not saying this is going to happen everywhere, but there is a massive issue around data and tech and how that's being governed. And then what does the policy infrastructure look in a way that we're not only doing an experiment that shifts the status quo on that particular issue, but it actually opens a space to change the way that business is done, right? So whether we use sandboxing or we use other types of methods to actually start building agility within the governments. And that, I think that goes with, and I think equally important to that actually is, I think it's important to recognize progress when progress is made and to give, and obviously we have a role to play in that. And what UNDP has generally shied away from is from being, I'd say, a little bit political. And I think we should not shy away from engaging with a political level and driving transformative change through that as well. So, a lot of the projects that we work on are very often driven by mayors who are really committed. And sometimes, especially at municipal level, we see much more competition than at the national level. So I think that's a very important entry point for us, and it's something we need to recognize. That's like a number of different issues on this.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for making the time. I think it was super interesting. And thank you, colleagues online. I think we can stop the transmission.
Is there like an Istanbul team also in other areas? So is there a milli in Africa or?
1 million.